Jason Vesper, March of the Monsters. Aside from the Javencia, the dimension-hopping, heroic vampire Jason fought a variety of monsters from across the multiverse. Whilst he didn't set out to be a champion or hero, the terrors these creatures inflicted on the rest of creation were enough to motivate him to be one. Jason later said that even the most amoral, selfish coward, as he professed to be before he set off in the balloon, could not turn a blind eye to what he witnessed. After the Javencia, Jason's greatest enemies were the Syntharc. These mechanical monsters were the product of magic rather than science. They originated from the Sephron universe, which, much like the Horvatia reality, was a place of chaos and darkness. Unlike the Horvatia reality, however, there was no ruling empire, at least not until the Syntharc took over. The universe suffered from overpopulation and dwindling resources, and the humanoid ancestors of the Syntharc, known as the Eukairo, became a highly advanced warrior race to protect their own planet. In their society, might was right, and leaders took control through force. Eventually, however, a ruling class of Eukairo was established, who, wanting to hold on to their power, turned to magic, something which most life forms in this reality had forsaken, as it was an even more unpredictable and dangerous force than in most other known universes. It seems that this universe was too small in general, as, unlike in other realities, where magic was balanced with the natural order, here the universe could barely contain it, and any tampering with magics, even for the most basic spell, could lead to devastation. Still, the elites of the Eukairo, in their arrogance, used magic to not only hold their own people down, but conquer and exterminate other races, becoming the rulers of their galaxy, though in the process many of the worlds they invaded with magic were ripped apart or permanently damned, not that the Eukairo cared. Eventually, however, the magic rebounded on them. There is usually a price when it comes to magic, no matter what universe, and in the Eukairo elite's case, the spell transformed them into monstrous caricatures of their view of the ultimate warriors. Their skin became a thick, hard, unfeeling metal, whilst their insides and blood became nothing but fire. Most the elites, after being trapped in these cold, unfeeling bodies, would be driven insane and kill themselves. Indeed, the process itself was enough to drive most of the Eukairo mad. The transformation was slow, with their skin gradually hardening until they could not move, whilst their insides and blood became so hot they burst into flames. It took weeks for their new magical bodies to get used to the heat and complete the transformation to the point where they could move, meaning in that time they were literally cooked from the inside, but were unable to move or scream. Whilst most went mad, the most wicked, power-hungry and cruel came to embrace their new, stronger bodies. They saw it as a blessing, and that their universe had chosen them to be its greatest warriors. There are some in the centuries since who have agreed with them, arguing that their universe was perhaps sentient and sought to conquer other realities, and used the transformed Eukairo as its soldiers, though others argued that magic does not care about whether or not it makes a life form more dangerous, just as long as it is punished, which the Eukairo elites most certainly were, even if they were too evil to understand it. The elites would later find a way to extract the curse from their bodies and use it to infect other members of their kind, creating an army. They also mixed the curse in with a brainwashing spell to stop those that they transformed from going insane and keep them loyal, though it didn't make the transformation any less agonizing for them. It was simply that afterwards they were now loyal to the Syntharc, as the elites referred to this new caricature of a race. With their new army in tow, these monsters would devastate many worlds in their own universe, building up an even greater empire than before, but it soon wasn't enough. They regarded the other life forms of their universe to be inferior scum, not worthy of their rule, and soon sought out other realities, becoming a race of interdimensional conquerors. They were, in fact, the first monsters that Jason and his first companion Joy encountered on the Earth, when their interdimensional crisis began on the Stars version of Earth. After foiling that invasion, he would face them many more times, both on Earth and beyond. His daughter Mona developed a passionate hatred of the monsters when they killed her lover, Martera. Another major race of enemies were the Dedrits, who were not just one race, but rather an interdimensional disease. No one knows where or how they began, but according to the legends, one of the first universes in the Alpha Omniverse, after the stars, became corrupted in some way. Whether it was an outside force from the void, a unique strain of magic, or even an experiment gone wrong with the natural forces, a rare form of energy within this universe became toxic and distorted, and developed a special kind of sentience. After wreaking havoc on its own reality, it would travel from universe to universe and infect each one, with these new infected areas simply being sentient and capable of spreading and travelling beyond their native realities. Jason likened their effects on a reality to cancer within the human body. They slowly not only broke down the laws and limitations of a universe, but corrupted them too. And, in some cases, possessed the native life forms who were turned into soldiers that could spread the infection more discreetly. Infected individual life forms were often referred to as lesser Dedrits. No matter what the life form looked like originally, they would almost always be twisted into roughly the same basic form. A hideous, blue-skinned, eyeless beast with razor-sharp teeth and a long, pristine tongue, though obviously there were variation in terms of limbs and the size of different creatures. Jason had seen their effects on many of the realities on his travels and fought with the infected Dedrits several times prior to his visit to the Stars universe. Some realities had been turned into burnt-out husks devoid of any life as a result of the Dedrit infection, whilst in other realities the harmful energy had been contained, but even then it still shortened the universe's lifespan by several trillion years due to its very presence. A few universes did actually manage to destroy the infection. Indeed, at this point, no one was even sure if the original Dedrit infection still existed. But whatever its true nature, one thing was for sure, was that the Dedrit's infections were a hive mind to some extent, and capable of communicating with one another and relaying information on which universes to infect. One Dedrit infection was brought to the Stars version of the Earth by the Rips and hoped to claim not only the Earth, but use the Rips to attack a wider range of universes than ever before. For all the chaos they caused, the Dedrits' plan was always simply to find a universe they could exist in. They knew that every reality they entered would be altered by their presence, and therefore always, no matter what, sought to kill or at least subjugate and infect all life forms in every universe they visited to ensure their own safety. Sadly for the Dedrits, they were also so toxic that any universe they took over eventually collapsed, to the point where even they could not exist within them. Still, they hoped one day to find a reality that could hold their presence, and were happy to destroy as many as they could to find it. Jason's previous battles with the interdimensional virus allowed him to contain, but not destroy, the Dedrit that had invaded the Earth, but many of the humans it had possessed were still able to escape and continue to try and free their master and spread the virus to other worlds, being a constant thorn in the side of Jason and his companions. These possessed humans were granted some independent thought by the Dedrit infection in order to make them more effective, but they were still completely brainwashed into being loyal to the Dedrit's cause. Jason would be forced to go to great lengths in order to stop the infection from spreading across the stars and other realities. Yet, in spite of this, he always retained a degree of compassion for the Dedrits. The vampire understood that, unlike most of his other enemies, in many ways they did not have a choice in what they were. They only wanted to exist, and Jason would continue to try and find a way to cure them through his entire stay on the Stars version of Earth and beyond. But he always knew that they were beyond reason, and that at times he had no choice but to destroy them. Perhaps his most personal enemies, however, were the Veshian horde from his own universe. They were originally a race of primitives that were enslaved by humanity. In fact, they were among the first races of the humans of the Seventh Earth conquered, though they did not do so with military might. Rather, the Veshians worshipped humanity due to how our counterparts aided them. With their superior technology, the humans of this reality cured diseases, ended famines, and built vast shelters to protect the Veshians. Sadly, whilst humanity's intentions may have been noble at this stage, it didn't take long for them to start exploiting these more primitive creatures and try and turn them into an expendable slave force. Though the Veshians would ultimately prove to be more useful as guard dogs and foot soldiers by the elites to crush resistance and conquer other planets. The Vescians physically were far superior to humans, possessing 6 claw-like hind limbs which could allow them to move at a considerable speed despite their massive size. They stood over 10 feet tall and weighed in at almost 2 tons. They also possessed physical strength up to 30 times that of a human and rock-hard skin capable of withstanding the most high firepower. The Vescians became just as hated by other races as the humans of this reality did, as they helped us butcher scores of other life forms enthusiastically, and eventually a race known as the Lao would gain its revenge against both humanity and the Vescians by cursing the latter, transforming them into hideous, demonic creatures who had no purpose beyond hunting and slaughtering humans. They became our ultimate predators. The curse was made up of the darkest magics from various planets throughout the universe, even those humanity thought they had under their thumb, whose people aided the Lao in secret to see their human race either beaten back or crushed completely. The magic was channeled through the rage of billions of creatures on hundreds of worlds throughout the cosmos. No power could undo the curse. Not even humanity, as many worlds had literally drained their planets dry of magic. And, on top of this, humanity could not afford to sacrifice any of its own magic for a similar spell. The draining of the worlds to create this one had set humanity back as well. The Vescian Horde, as they became known, slaughtered billions of humans. Entire colonies were wiped out, and the monsters even invaded the 7th universe's version of Earth, to the point where it would never be habitable by humans again. By this stage, humanity had colonized hundreds of thousands of worlds, with Jason himself having been born on the colony of Rakari. Still, the loss of their Mother Earth was a blow that humanity never truly recovered from. The beasts were ultimately beaten back by humanity, with Mona, Jason's daughter again, taking part in the conflict against them, for which she was honoured by being made into a vampire. Jason left his reality before the complete defeat of the Vescian Horde, and after the Lao were exterminated. Humanity believed that if they wiped out the Lao, then the curse would be broken. They gave the Lao several opportunities to undo the curse, but sadly that ability was beyond even Lao or humanity, and so humanity exterminated them with a weapon that ripped the Lao's very planet apart. Mona took part in this atrocity, being part of a battle fleet around the planet as it was being destroyed to stop any spaceships from escaping, for which Jason could never forgive her. Just as Jason had warned them, the destruction of the Lao did not erase the Vescian Horde, and the battle continued on for years afterwards. Whilst this war did eventually see the destruction of most of the Vescians, a few escaped to other realities through the interdimensional experiments that were continued after Jason's departure, where they would continue to attack humans in any universe they existed in. The Vescians wiped humanity out in many universes before eventually reaching the stars. Like the Dedrits, they split off into different groups, some of which were more proficient in certain realities than others. When Jason learned the truth, he was overcome with despair at the fact that his interdimensional experiments had helped to unleash these monsters on the multiverse, and became determined to destroy the Vescians to perhaps a greater extent than any of his other enemies. His battle with these monsters would eventually see him return to his home reality and reunite with his daughter, when a group of Vescians used one of the rips on the Earth to travel back to their home universe. In spite of how many counterparts they killed off, they would always yearn to kill off the original humans. Jason and Mona were able to defeat these monsters together, but sadly, Jason still couldn't forgive Mona. Not that she wanted his forgiveness. She viewed him as a coward who abandoned his people, and argued that his experiments had ultimately allowed the Vescians to escape to other universes and slaughter others, and, whilst he did bear the guilt of his mistake, he still argued that at least his mistake was not a deliberate act of cruelty like hers. In spite of their animosity, Mona kept the fact that he had returned a secret so his people would not arrest him for his desertion in cutting off contact from them, though that may have been so that she could take the full credit for stopping the Vescian invasion. Another major enemy of Jason's were the vampires from his later companion Renee's reality. In her universe, vampires had a very different origin from those in the Stars universe. They were actually alien-human hybrids. Eons ago, in this reality, a race of aliens known as the Varlenia arrived on the Earth some time before recorded history began, and spliced their DNA with that of humans. The Varlenia were a race of pitiless conquerors who had almost been completely wiped out and sought to continue their race by splicing their DNA onto that of humanity, as there were too few of them to sustain a breeding population. Ultimately, the experiments went wrong and created horrific Varlenian-human hybrid creatures whose own unstable bodies required them to drink the blood of other creatures to survive. The mutation, however, did offer up some advantages. It slowed down their aging to the point where they were immortal, increased their strength, healing, and durability. Only decapitation or complete destruction of the heart could destroy them, and exposure to ultraviolet light, a weakness the Varlenia race, who came from a world with a dying sun and weren't as used to ultraviolet light, was amplified due to the hybrid's unstable DNA. Whilst all of the mutants retained these basic traits, mentally and physically they could vary considerably. Some mutations were more unstable in certain individuals than others, leading to some hybrids degenerating physically into hideous, monstrous creatures, and others being reduced to the level of animals mentally. Most, however, were at least able to retain a human form for short periods and blend in, though their personalities were all to some extent made unstable by the mutation. Though this was not an accident. The Varlenian had deliberately engineered them to be vicious predators, devoid of any remorse, in order to make them the perfect warriors to inflict their revenge against the rest of their universe. Worst of all, these hybrids were able to spread their mutation through an infectious bite, as again the Varlenian had engineered this aspect of their biology, hoping they could spread across the world in no time. Sadly for the Varlenians, their hybrids were too wild and slaughtered all of their kind. The hybrids, meanwhile, very nearly wiped out humanity, but fortunately, as human prey became more scarce, they turned on and eventually killed each other until only a few were left. The last few surviving hybrids remained in the shadows as humanity slowly recovered. The hybrids from this point on would be very careful in only turning a few they deemed worthy so as not to kill off their food supply, and continue to live in the shadows, though in spite of this, myths would develop about them, and in time humanity came to call them vampires. The last Varlenian ship had been uncovered in 1985 beneath a mountain in the Scottish Highlands, along with the fossilised remains of a Varlenian. Thomas Bracken, one of the most influential and powerful vampire leaders, was a scientist in life and continued to use his expertise as much as he could about vampirism, not in the hopes of curing it, but in making his people stronger, and used his skills to analyse the strains of vampirism like none before him, and determined that it was truly unlike any other virus on Earth. After studying the last Varlenian, he discovered the link between them and vampire kind, which would allow Bracken to learn more about the strain of vampirism than anyone else, even the Varlenians themselves, whose resources were more limited. Bracken subsequently used this knowledge to perform experiments that made vampires stronger and even immune to certain weaknesses. His ultimate aim was to allow vampires to usurp humanity, as, like many vampires, he was terrified of his kind's existence being discovered. He not only wanted to remove their weaknesses, but find a way for vampires to reproduce naturally, without infecting humans. His experiments did allow some vampires to reproduce, but the results were always utterly hideous abominations, often devoid of any higher brain functions beyond savage bloodlust. An organisation known as AVES, Adaptive Vampire Extermination System, that had been established by the UN in 1970, targeted Bracken's experiments above all else and were able to turn the tide against the vampire, which forced Bracken to finally expose his kind to the world through a political assassination of the President of the US on television. Deep down, he only cared about himself, and as his own kind abandoned him out of fear of the AVES, Bracken knew that exposing the vampires would force them to follow him when they were exposed. Sure enough, Bracken would rise up as the leader of the vampire kind in the ensuing war that began in 2003, and one that eventually led to the destruction of the surface of the planet, when, ironically, the human leaders in their desperation blitzed the surface of the Earth to kill off the vampires, whilst they remained safely underground with their elites, who could emerge again after to build a better world. The weapons killed most of humanity and vampire kind, but Bracken and his elites were, thanks to their experiments, able to survive the post-Fallout world, albeit barely. After the blast, Bracken began to experiment with the weakened barriers between realities created by the portal that sent Renee to the Star's universe, which we shall explore in greater detail in the next article. With Bracken not believing the story before now, he only turned to it out of desperation. Bracken's experiments not only opened the portal again, but splintered it, leading to multiple portals on his Earth, which allowed his vampires to travel to multiple other realities, some of which they devastated. Jason encountered these bloodsuckers before he arrived on Earth in multiple other realities, including their home universe, and many times after, with the vampires, much like the Jarventia, splitting up in different groups across the multiverse. Bracken himself, meanwhile, became arguably Jason's single greatest individual adversary. Even after he was banished from the rest of his kind, the vampire would later master interdimensional travel to the same extent as Jason and proceed to cause chaos across the multiverse. Just as Jason enjoyed the freedom to explore and see new worlds and realities, then Bracken embraced the ability to unravel other worlds and sow the seeds of chaos and destruction in a way he never thought possible. Another of Jason's most dangerous adversaries were the Marvin Kriya, who originated from a universe that was toxic to all other realities. The space between the worlds of this reality was a green, noxious liquid that was capable of consuming all physical matter from other realities. Much like the Jarventia's home universe, it was a completely unique universe with no duplicates. Quite what had reduced it to this state, or whether it was always naturally toxic, no one is sure, but the reality had always endured attacks by the great powers from various other universes. Those who wanted to eliminate the danger it posed, or who wanted to harness its toxic properties as a weapon. Though all physical matter from other universes succumbed to this poison, other forms of energy and magic could neutralize or dilute its power. The constant attacks and destruction of various planets and even galaxies led to one race, the Marvin Kriya, advancing to an incredible extent to protect themselves from the other races. Ironically, the Marvin Kriya were physically weak, jellyfish-like creatures who had always been vulnerable in their home world, which pushed them to develop at a faster rate than most other species already, just to survive. But the threats to their very plane of existence pushed them further until they became the most advanced life forms in this toxic reality. Whilst the other species viewed them as heroes at first for defending their universe, it didn't take long for the Marvin Kriya to become corrupted by power, and they subsequently ruled over the rest of their reality that became dependent on them with such cruelty some of their subjects even sided with the attackers against the Marvin Kriya. Eventually, the Marvin Kriya came to believe that the only way their reality would be safe was to conquer and subjugate all other great powers that threatened them across the multiverse. Though, in truth, they were obsessed with power more than anything else, and in time they soon came to desire ruling the multiverse itself. Their soldiers were housed within large, tank-like robots that were capable of levitating and flying, whilst their primary weapons were contained within their clawed hands and fired a diluted version of the poison of their universe. The top section of the war machine was see-through, though it was not made of glass, but rather a transparent form of metal from their universe. The Marvin Kriya used this metal so they could face their enemies. Finally, another of Jason's worst adversaries were the Jarax, who originally began as humans from another universe, far beyond Jason's home reality. Much like in Jason's universe, humans became the dominant life forms, but it was not through conquest. Rather, they were the last species to survive this universe. Time moved more quickly in their reality than in most others, to the point where it had almost reached the end of its lifespan by the time humanity had first emerged in the Star's universe. The collapse of the Jarax's universe had caused the extinction of all other races, but the indomitable will of humanity allowed it to survive and eventually rebuild and postpone the lifespan of its universe indefinitely. Tragically, in the process, the humans who had evolved into a new race, the Jarax, were twisted and mutated to the point where they became degenerate monsters, both physically and mentally. Whether this transformation was caused by the desperate circumstances when their universe was dying, or if perhaps it was a result of what they did to their universe when saving it, it is not known, though the Jarax would often claim that they simply represented the ultimate evolution of humanity. Regardless, the Jarax did not view themselves as monsters. Instead, they believed themselves to be the supreme beings who had outlasted all other life forms and saved the universe itself, and, after discovering the existence of other universes with other versions of Earth, they believed it was their duty to guide humanity from each universe into becoming the masters, like them. They believed they could only do this by conquering each Earth and forcing its people to follow their path. Versions of Earth, where humans were not the dominant life forms, were destroyed meanwhile, whilst universes that had no versions of the Earth would also be regarded as unworthy of life and destroyed by these monsters, and finally, even humans who they believed were beyond saving, they exterminated. Whilst Jason faced these monsters many times and foiled several of their invasions, the Jarax did not despise Jason the way his other enemies did, at least not at first. They were proud that he represented a universe where humanity had taken its rightful place as the supreme beings, and that he had helped other versions of the planet throughout the multiverse. They only hoped that he would share their vision. Still, as time went on and the more he set back their plans, the more they grew to genuinely hate the vampire and became obsessed with destroying him. These were simply the most documented of the monsters Jason faced throughout his centuries-long life. His travels took him to the darkest corners of the multiverse and beyond. But, fortunately, he also made many friends and allies over the course of his adventures who would help him battle these horrors. And, in the next and final article, we shall explore their history with the vampire.